In 1886, the Roman Catholic Church in the Oblades arrived on Cowsis First Nation. And that is when the grave site began. In 1898, the Merivale Residential School opened its doors, and it closed its doors in 1996. The Roman Catholic Church overseen the grave site. The Catholics and the prayer and religion overseen the grave site. We started our radar penetrating research on June the 2nd of 2021. As of yesterday, we have hit 751 unmarked graves. This is not a mass grave site. These are unmarked graves. Over the past years, the oral stories of our elders, of our survivors, and friends of our survivors have told us stories that knew these burials were here. In 1960, there may have been marks on these graves. The Catholic Church representatives removed these headstones, and today they are unmarked graves.
Good evening. It has been a somber and heavy day. The details in our stories tonight will be distressing. Please take care. People here in Saskatchewan and across the country are trying to come to terms with the news you just heard from Cowsis First Nation Chief Cadmus Delorme. The remains of 751 people, mostly children, found in unmarked graves. Jason Warwick is following this story and joins us live. Jason, what more can you tell us about what we learned this morning?
Well, Sam, as you heard, there are details emerging, but the real bombshell is that number, 751 unmarked graves discovered at the Cowsis First Nation east of Regina. That's triple the number, more than triple the number that was announced in the shocking discovery in Kamloops a few weeks ago. That's also more than the total number of confirmed deaths in all of the history of residential schools across this entire province. That's sat at 588. So just a monumental announcement here. Chief Cadmus Delorme says that they're still coming to terms with it. They haven't completed the search, so that number could rise, as it could across the province in places like Muskowgon and Battleford and LeBret and every corner of the province where these searches are taking place. But Chief Delorme says they will begin the process of identifying these graves as quickly as they can. He says it won't be easy, it will be very painful, but it is necessary to find the truth. Here's what he said.
The oral stories, as well as our strong Kokums and Mushums grandparents, help bury many. And so they have written records, oral stories. So we've been trying to capture those. And we have full faith that the Roman Catholic Church will release our records. They have not told us no. We just don't have them yet.
Again, that was Chief Cadmus Delorme, Cowsis First Nation, after the discovery of those unmarked graves at the residential school site. He says that healing is a big part of this, but so is justice. He said this is being treated like a crime scene, Sam.
Jason, we've heard so many accounts today, including one from a knowledge keeper who went to Merivale. What can you tell me about her story?
Well, knowledge keeper Florence Sparvier, she's also an elder. She's a third-generation student survivor at the Merivale Residential School at Cowsis. She says that a large amount of the difficulties that First Nations face today and generations will in the future are in large part attributed to the abuse, the deaths, the disappearances, the cultural shame that were imposed on them by the residential schools. Here she is.
They were putting us down as a people. So we learned how to not like who we were. And that has gone on and on, and it's still going on. Because we couldn't teach our people, our own families, how to look after themselves physically, mentally, emotionally, and spiritually.
Again, Elder Sparvier recounting her experiences at the Marival Indian Residential School at Cowessess. Despite the pain that she and her family have experienced at the school, she has spent her life reaching out to help others. She also invited people to come and learn more from her and from others about this very sad situation. Sam.
Jason, reporters from all over the world were asking questions in that news conference this morning. What can you tell us about the international attention that this story is receiving?
Yes, well, it was quite apparent that this was a monumental announcement, and right at the news conference there were questions from Germany, there were questions from Spain. I've been talking to people in the Netherlands and in countries in Central America. There is a high interest in what is happening here. There is a spotlight on this province, there is a spotlight on the Cowessess First Nation. This is a painful time, everyone says, but they all agree, whether it's Elder Sparvier or the leadership, that this is painful, but they want everyone to know the truth. And that includes FSIN Chief Bobby Cameron. He was at the news conference as well today. He said that the truth will come out, that this isn't the end of these types of discoveries, and he wants Canadians to know the truth. Here he is.
This was a crime against humanity, an assault on First Nation people. We are proud people. The only crime we ever committed as children was being born Indigenous.
Again, that was FSIN Chief Bobby Cameron speaking at the news conference today. A lot of anger from a lot of people, but also a lot of resolve. They want justice. As you heard, a lot of them are talking about this being a crime scene, or that these were crimes against humanity. They want investigations, they want inquiries to happen. They also want the unfinished business of the Catholic Church to be wrapped up. They specifically singled out the Catholic Church, which ran the school at Cowessess and in Kamloops. The Catholic Church, as they note, are the only organization which has not paid its full share of the compensation, which was agreed to in the monumental settlement agreement a number of years ago. The Catholic Church is also being asked for documents that people say have not been released. And despite calls from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission for the Pope to apologize on Canadian soil, including a plan to bring the Pope to Wanuskewin a few years ago, that has not yet happened. So we'll see what happens. Sam?
All right, thank you, Jason. CBC reporter Jason Warwick live in Regina tonight. If you feel like you need support today, the National Indian Residential School Crisis Line provides support to any former students and others affected. You can access services 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. The number is 1-866-925-4419. Locally, a Treaty 4 support line has also been set up for those in southern Saskatchewan. You can reach that at 306-522-7494. The discoveries, first in Kamloops and now at Cowessess, are bringing up past trauma and memories for many survivors. The chief of the Little Pine First Nation says it's frustrating that Indigenous people keep having to prove they were hurt, and the evidence keeps mounting.
And yet there is still so many of the great majority of Canada that don't understand our grief, that deny us our right to grieve. That is what really hurts. We are going to need very strong leaders to step up and help make things right. And unfortunately, from all my experience, I have not found leaders from the government of Canada that are willing to step up to the table with Native leaders to make things right.
At 71 years old, Frank Badger still has vivid, disturbing memories about how he was treated as a child in the St. Michael's School at Duck Lake. He says he feels lucky to have made it out alive.
When I started school back in 1955, I was 6 years old, and my first form of discipline was to be hit with a logging train by one of the supervisors. And they had all sorts of weapons. They had 2x4s, broomsticks, belts, straps, whips, whatever. And these are things that used to hit us. Some of them used to punch us in the head, slap us. One of the supervisors slapped me that one time, and he just about knocked me out. I just saw black and stars, and just about fell off the chair where he was cutting my hair. But with these deaths, it brought back a lot of the issues that I went through in residential school. You know, all the beatings it took, you know, all the bad things that we were called. We were called savages, pagans, heathens. And at 6 years old, how can I be a savage? I mean, how can I be a pagan? How can I be a heathen at 6 years old? I was just a little kid.
The executive director of the First Nations Child and Family Caring Society says now is the time for accountability and learning from the past. Cindy Blackstock says the government already has the solutions to help remedy some of the calls to action. But she says the will to do so needs to be there from politicians at all levels.
The Truth and Reconciliation Commission's top calls to action are about remedying the injustices that are continuing to occur for First Nations, Métis, and Inuit children. What people can do is, most importantly, is honor these children by stopping the injustices today. And they are continuing today. Those same inequalities continue today and undermine the health and well-being of First Nations children. So it's not enough just to feel badly about this. We have to learn from it in order to really pay honor to these children. And in fact, that's what Tecumseh Chief Casimir was asking too. She said, we need to have justice come out of this. This can't be another kind of symbolic mourning of the country. We have to move to a place where we ensure that this is the last generation of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit children that have to recover from their childhood.
As Chief Delorme said earlier, this ground search has been in the works for a while. We caught up with him a few weeks ago when the work began. He told us he knew the process would be emotional, but that it is a necessary step for reconciliation.
We are at the Cowes First Nation community gravesite. Years ago, this was once the Merivale Residential School gravesite. All around me are unmarked graves. We know that our loved ones here, our ancestors are here. In our truth as finding as a First Nation and the surrounding communities that have come to this residential school, this is where our truth lies. And in the coming months, we will be identifying our unmarked graves in our truth and reconciliation moving forward. Behind me is now our community gravesite, which we're very proud of. Our loved ones are all around here. But over here is where the history lies. This is starting back far as 1885 to 1975. Underneath here, we now have to make sure our loved ones are identified, that we put respectable marks down commemorating that someone is here. And so when we do our mourning and our prayers and our ceremonies, that we respectfully know that someone is here. And that is our reconciliation as Cowes First Nation.
One of the big questions is how the Catholic Church will help survivors move forward in healing. Regina's Archbishop calls the discovery at Cowes overwhelming. Donald Bolin says some plans have been delayed due to the pandemic, but he's been working with the First Nation since Chief Delorme wrote to the Roman Catholic Archdiocese 3 years ago.
Going through the grave sites is going to bring waves of suffering and of trauma. And it's our desire to accompany Indigenous people in whatever way we can in that process and to support them. Knowing the past, naming what happened as clear as we can from a church's perspective, then apologizing anew, but also taking concrete actions to act on those apologies, walking in solidarity, joining Indigenous people in engaging in those calls to action to build the kind of future that Chief Delorme talked about. That's our desire to participate in all of that. I issued a letter to the Indigenous people of Treaty 4 a couple days ago, really saying that we're ready for that conversation. I know that they have called for Pope Francis to come to Canada and apologize. The Bishops' Conference is working with Indigenous national organizations to organize a delegation that would go to Rome before the end of the year, who would meet with Pope Francis, including Indigenous leaders and knowledge keepers and survivors and elders and youth, and where they could speak directly to Pope Francis and he could hear them directly. So I think that's a really important step, and I look forward to that happening.
Provincial politicians are also reflecting on the discovery. Premier Scott Moe offered his condolences but declined to comment. The government says it wanted to stay silent to, quote, elevate the stories of residential school survivors, end quote. The opposition held a news conference today, and the NDP's Saskatoon Centre MLA, Betty Nippy Albright, took the lead, speaking as both an elected official and as a residential school survivor.
We needed something huge like these discoveries for society to wake up. Hopefully society's woken up enough to actually not become desensitized, because more and more is going to be discovered, but to actually do something. So I certainly hope that this is a moment for all of us as citizens of this country, and in this province in particular, and to speak about this province, for us as citizens in this province to actually demand that our province respond in a meaningful way that is actually going to help us move and build relationships, respectful relationships, and start addressing the systemic racism that is so entrenched in this province.
Federal politicians also shared their responses on Twitter today. Here are some of them. From the Prime Minister, my heart breaks for the Cowessess First Nation following the discovery of Indigenous children buried at the former Maryville Residential School. We cannot bring them back, but we will honor their memory and we will tell the truth about these injustices. From Conservative leader Aaron O'Toole, Canada's Conservatives acknowledge the deep sorrow and mourning that all Indigenous people and survivors of residential schools are experiencing. Our hearts grieve for the Cowessess First Nation and surrounding Indigenous communities who are sharing in this trauma. And from NDP leader Jagmeet Singh, 751. The unmarked graves of 751 more Indigenous bodies have been uncovered. This is genocide, and it's not good enough for this Liberal government to only offer condolences. There remains an unbroken legacy of injustice as long as Justin Trudeau fights Indigenous kids in court. Stay with us. We have more news after the break.